September 19, 1944. Thick fog rolled over the fields near Arracourt, France. Inside a Sherman tank belonging to the 37th Tank Battalion, First Lieutenant Merwin Men gripped the rim of his turret while his gunner squinted through the periscope, scanning the ghostly mist ahead. Every man inside knew the danger that might be waiting beyond that veil. The German Panther, a tank whose sloped armor and deadly 75mm high-velocity cannon had already earned a terrifying reputation. What Men and his crew did not know was that stowed inside their ammunition rack were 6 rounds that would soon change the nature of tank warfare. These were the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing HVAP shells, each with a tungsten carbide core, designed to cut through steel like a blade through glass. In the hours to come, these few rounds would alter not just the outcome of an engagement but the very psychology of tank combat in Western Europe. The appearance of the HVAP round was the culmination of a scientific and industrial race, one born from a crisis that the U.S. Army had failed to foresee. By early 1944, American armored forces were running into a problem that doctrine and optimism had not prepared them for. The trusty M4 Sherman, the backbone of Allied armor, was finding itself outclassed. The German Panther tank, conceived as a counter to the Soviet T-34, combined mobility, a powerful 75mm KWK-42L/70 gun, and an ingeniously sloped armor layout. Its frontal glacis, 80mm thick and angled at 55 degrees, effectively provided protection equivalent to about 140mm of vertical armor. To the crews of Shermans, that made it virtually impervious. American intelligence had underestimated both the quality and the quantity of Panthers that would appear in Normandy. Before D-Day, planners assumed that the Allies would face only small numbers of heavy German tanks. But by the time the landings began in June 1944, nearly 38% of all German tanks in France were Panthers. Hundreds rolled into battle, often crewed by green troops, yes, but encased in armor that Allied weapons could scarcely touch. The standard American 75mm M3 gun, the mainstay of most Shermans, proved helpless against the Panther's frontal armor. Its shells would simply ricochet off the sloped plating even at point-blank range. Meanwhile, the Panther's long 75mm gun could pierce a Sherman's armor from well over 2,000 meters away. Even the improved 76mm M1 gun, designed to give the Sherman a fighting chance, could only penetrate about 109mm of steel at 1,000 meters, and only if the target was struck directly. Against the Panther's front, that wasn't enough. The problem wasn't entirely the gun itself. It was the ammunition. Early in 1944, the U.S. had already begun producing Shermans fitted with the 76mm gun, known as M4A1 76 variants. They rolled off the line in January, and 130 of them were shipped to Britain that April, well before D-Day. Yet, remarkably, not a single one was used in the initial invasion. Commanders feared that introducing a new gun would complicate logistics by requiring different ammunition supplies. Many officers also believed the older 75mm gun was still good enough for the expected opposition. That assumption would prove disastrously wrong. By July, after a month of bitter fighting in Normandy, American tank crews were sending home grim reports. They could not kill Panthers head-on. On July 2, 1944, the matter reached the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. His incredulous response became famous. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out? I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." By mid-July, an official board confirmed what frontline crews already knew. American tank guns could not reliably penetrate a Panther's front armor. General Omar Bradley immediately ordered that the 76mm Shermans still in Britain be rushed to France. On July 25, during Operation Cobra, these tanks saw combat for the first time. But even then, disappointment followed. The 76mm was better, yes, but still not enough. The Shermans had to get dangerously close to hit weak spots like the Panther's gun mantlet or flanks, both risky maneuvers under enemy fire. Tankers realized that while they might be able to outmaneuver a Panther, they couldn't outgun it, at least not yet. The real solution would come not from a new tank or gun, but from advances in metallurgy and physics. As early as 1942, American ordnance engineers had been experimenting with new armor-piercing ammunition. Their goal was to increase impact energy without increasing gun size, a difficult challenge. The breakthrough came with the T4 round, soon standardized as the M93 HVAP. Unlike conventional shells, which relied on hardened steel for penetration, the HVAP used a dense tungsten carbide core surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and a ballistic cap. The idea was simple but revolutionary. By concentrating the projectile's mass in a smaller, ultra-dense core, the shell could maintain extreme velocity while minimizing drag. When fired from the 76mm gun, the M93 round achieved a muzzle velocity of over 1,000 meters per second, about 30% faster than the standard M62 armor-piercing round. That boost in speed translated directly into greater penetration. In tests, the HVAP could pierce up to 160 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, roughly 914 meters. For the first time, a Sherman's gun could reliably punch through the curved 100 millimeters mantlet of a Panther, even at a moderate distance. But developing the HVAP was only half the battle. Producing it in quantity proved a logistical nightmare. The new shell's effectiveness depended entirely on tungsten carbide, one of the hardest substances on Earth, and one in short supply. The majority of the world's tungsten came from China, which produced about 36% of the global supply before the war. America also had limited deposits in Colorado, Nevada, and California, but these barely met the demands of toolmaking and industrial use, let alone tank ammunition. Each 76mm HVAP shell consumed nearly 0.9 kilograms of tungsten carbide. A Sherman carrying just 6 of them used up almost 5 kilograms of the precious metal. Multiply that across entire battalions, and the strain became clear. Tungsten was needed everywhere, for cutting tools, for anti-tank rounds of other calibers, for hardening steel, and even for aircraft engine manufacturing. Germany faced even worse shortages. By late 1944, Swedish tungsten exports had declined sharply, and domestic production was negligible. The German war industry began hoarding tungsten for essential machine tools rather than ammunition, meaning most Panther crews would never see tungsten-cored shells of their own. By contrast, American factories, despite shortages, managed to ramp up HVAP production just enough to make a difference. In July 1944, they produced 1,000 rounds. By August, another 1,000. By November, monthly output reached 5,000 rounds, and by early 1945, that number had risen to 7,000 per month. In total, around 33,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP were produced before the war ended. Yet that was still far from enough. By February 1945, the average Sherman carried only 5 HVAP shells, 5 chances to pierce the front of a Panther before switching back to standard ammunition. It wasn't just a battle of technology. It was a battle of resources, of industry, and of time, all culminating in the fog-covered fields outside Arracourt, where American tank crews would put those precious few tungsten rounds to the ultimate test. Morning broke on September 19, 1944, near the French town of Arracourt, and the battlefield was blanketed in a thick, disorienting fog. Visibility dropped to just a few dozen meters, a rare stroke of fortune for the outnumbered Americans. Hidden somewhere within that mist were the dark silhouettes of German armor, elements of the Panzer Brigade 113 and 11th Panzer Division, newly reinforced with Panther tanks. Facing them was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, part of the 4th Armored Division, under General Patton's Third Army. Their Shermans were outgunned and, on paper, outmatched. But they were commanded by veterans who had learned to think fast, shoot faster, and make every advantage count, including a new secret weapon in their ammunition racks. Inside one of those Shermans sat Lieutenant Merwin Men, his crew nervously peering into the fog. Suddenly, from the haze, the shadow of a tank loomed. It was a Panther, unmistakable, its gun jutting forward like a spear. Men shouted a fire command. The gunner swung the turret aimed center mass and squeezed the trigger. The 76mm cannon roared, and a tungsten-cored HVAP round streaked out at supersonic speed. A bright flash erupted where it struck. The tungsten core sliced through the Panther's glassy plate, shattering into fragments inside the fighting compartment. Flames burst from the hatches. The German tank lurched to a halt, its crew scrambling out amid smoke and confusion. It was one of the first confirmed kills by an HVAP round in combat. The effect stunned both sides. The Americans had, for once, found a shell that could kill a Panther head-on, something that had seemed nearly impossible only weeks earlier. Fog and fire. The Battle of Arracourt quickly descended into a chaotic melee. The thick fog nullified the Germans' long-range gunnery advantage. Instead of the 2,000-meter duels they preferred, the Panthers were forced into close combat where agility, crew skill, and coordination mattered more than raw firepower. The Germans advanced confidently at first. Many of their tankers were replacements, some barely trained, told that the Americans were retreating. But as the fog lifted in patches, they found themselves driving straight into hidden American ambushes. Shermans popped in and out of cover, striking from hull-down positions or from behind hedgerows. Their commanders had learned to fire first, move immediately, and never linger. The HVAP rounds, scarce but precious, were reserved for when a Panther revealed its front. Even so, they were never plentiful. In many platoons, each tank carried only a handful of HVAP shells, often 4 or 5. Crews saved them like gold, loading them only when they expected a Panther or Tiger ahead. Against lighter vehicles like Panzer IVs or half-tracks, the standard M62 armor-piercing shell was sufficient. The coordination between tanks and supporting units was extraordinary. American tankers worked hand in glove with artillery and reconnaissance planes. When the fog cleared, air support joined in P-47 Thunderbolts screaming down to strafe and bomb. The combined firepower shattered German cohesion. By day's end, the 37th Tank Battalion and supporting infantry had destroyed or captured more than 80 German tanks and assault guns, while losing fewer than a dozen Shermans themselves. The Germans, stunned by the scale of their defeat, blamed superior enemy coordination and sudden air attacks. Few realized that part of their undoing had been the small, dense slugs of tungsten flying from American guns. Understanding the edge. What made the HVAP round so effective and so rare was not just its raw penetration but how it delivered that power. The tungsten core's density, about 15 grams per cubic centimeter, allowed it to retain kinetic energy better than steel, even as it slowed in flight. When it struck armor, the immense pressure at the point of impact caused the steel to flow like a liquid, punching open a narrow channel. At a muzzle velocity exceeding 1,000 meters per second, the HVAP shell could pierce armor that normal rounds simply dented. Against the Panther's 80mm glassy, it had about a 50 to 60% chance of penetration at 800 meters, far from perfect, but a massive leap from the hopeless odds of the regular M62. However, its light aluminum jacket meant it lost speed quickly. Beyond 1,200 meters, performance dropped sharply, and accuracy suffered. In long-range engagements, tankers still preferred standard armor-piercing shells. But in the close, fog-shrouded fields of Arracourt, where most fighting occurred within 800 meters, the HVAP was deadly. The U.S. Army quickly began gathering after-action reports. Crews repeatedly described the HVAP as miracle ammunition, but they also begged for more. Production, however, could not keep up. Tungsten, the strategic metal. Behind the scenes, a logistical tug-of-war was underway over tungsten supplies. The same metal that made HVAP possible was essential to countless other wartime industries. Tungsten carbide was used in machine tools that cut hardened steel, in armor-piercing shells for aircraft guns, and even in manufacturing the jet engines and bombs of the Army Air Forces. In Washington, debates raged between ordnance officials and the War Production Board. Some argued that the limited tungsten should go to industrial tools to make the factories themselves more efficient. Others insisted that the new HVAP rounds could tip the balance in armored combat. To complicate matters, the global tungsten supply was unstable. Much of it came from China's Yunnan province, controlled by the nationalist government but threatened by Japanese advances. Shipments often had to travel through perilous routes like the Burma Road or the Hump Airlift, and losses were frequent. Even so, by late 1944, enough tungsten reached American shores to keep HVAP production alive. Each month, more rounds reached the front, but never enough to fully equip every unit. Most battalions received just a few crates at a time, distributed sparingly to platoons expected to face heavy German armor. Tank crews often shared HVAP rounds between vehicles. Some commanders even reserved them for specific gunners known for their accuracy. In effect, the precious tungsten shells became tactical assets, deployed where they'd make the most difference. Learning to fight the Panther. The Battle of Arracourt marked a turning point in how American crews approached tank combat. They began to develop a specific anti-Panther doctrine based on experience, speed, and the selective use of HVAP. Instead of trying to fight toe-to-toe, Sherman units used terrain and maneuver to expose the Panther's side armor, only 40 to 50 millimeters thick, then finished the job with high-velocity fire. Tank commanders learned to bait enemy gunners into firing first, then reposition and strike while the German crew reloaded. HVAP changed the psychology of these duels. Where before the sight of a Panther might have filled a crew with dread, now there was confidence, not reckless bravery, but the calm assurance that they had at least a fighting chance. Even with HVAP, the Sherman was no superweapon. It remained thin-skinned, prone to catching fire when hit, and underpowered compared to German heavy tanks. But with better coordination, superior logistics, and a few ounces of tungsten in each shell, it could win. The Germans, meanwhile, were facing their own problems. The Panther's complex suspension and engine required constant maintenance. Many of the tanks sent to Lorraine broke down before even reaching battle. The combination of mechanical failure, poor visibility, and the Americans' aggressive tactics turned what might have been a crushing German counterattack into a disastrous rout. By the time the fog cleared on September 22nd, the German armored thrust had been decisively blunted. Over the course of the Arracourt battles, U.S. forces destroyed more than 285 German tanks and assault guns, while losing around 35 Shermans. The message was clear: technology alone could not guarantee victory. But technology used intelligently, even in small doses like a few tungsten rounds per tank, could change the odds. By the autumn of 1944, the high-velocity armor-piercing HVAP round had proven its worth on the battlefield, but its success only underscored a new problem: scarcity. Every crew that used HVAP reported its extraordinary effectiveness, yet across Europe, the rounds remained maddeningly rare. Factories back in the United States were working around the clock to turn out more, but tungsten, the vital ingredient, was becoming one of the war's most strategic commodities. The supply bottleneck wasn't in manufacturing, it was in raw material. Without tungsten carbide, the HVAP was just another empty casing. The War Production Board and the Ordnance Department were in constant dispute over how to allocate the limited tungsten stocks. The same metal was needed for machine tools that cut tank armor and aircraft parts, the very backbone of the U.S. war industry. Diverting too much tungsten to ammunition meant slowing factory output. But diverting too little meant sending tank crews into battle without the one shell that could defeat a Panther frontally. To make matters worse, America's primary source, Chinese tungsten ore, was under immense pressure. Japanese forces had advanced deep into China, disrupting mines and transport routes. The Burma Road, a crucial supply artery, had been closed in 1942 and only reopened in early 1945. Even then, shipments were unpredictable. Alternative sources were sought in Bolivia, Portugal, and the United States itself, but refining tungsten was a slow, costly process. Every kilogram counted. An internal ordnance memo from late 1944 captured the dilemma succinctly. Our armored forces in France are requesting HVAP ammunition in quantities beyond present production capabilities. Until new tungsten sources are secured, issue must remain restricted to units facing confirmed heavy armor opposition. In practical terms, that meant most tank battalions received only small monthly shipments. A typical 37th Tank Battalion allotment might include a few dozen rounds, barely enough to give each Sherman 4 or 5 HVAP shells. Some units saw none at all. The scarcity fostered ingenuity. Crews developed unofficial systems of rationing, saving their HVAP for Panther encounters, pooling ammo at the platoon level, and sharing between tanks depending on who was most likely to make contact. Some gunners marked their precious tungsten rounds with chalk or colored tape to ensure they wouldn't be fired accidentally at soft targets. It was a curious irony. In an army famous for overwhelming firepower and industrial scale, a single round of ammunition had become a rare, almost artisanal weapon. Combat lessons and tactical evolution. The arrival of HVAP didn't just alter the physics of combat. It changed the mindset of American tankers. Before, most engagements against Panthers relied on maneuver and teamwork to exploit side armor. But now, tank commanders had another option: to stand and fight, if necessary, from the front. Still, doctrine emphasized caution. Tank manuals and after-action bulletins stressed that even with HVAP, a frontal duel was to be avoided unless no other choice existed. The tungsten round might penetrate the Panther's gun mantlet, but it couldn't guarantee survival in a head-on exchange. Training evolved to reflect this. Crews were drilled to recognize German silhouettes instantly, to distinguish a Panther from a Panzer IV at a glance, to aim for weak points, and to use smoke or terrain to mask movement. Gunners were taught to switch ammunition on the fly. High explosive, HE, for infantry, M62 armor-piercing for lighter armor, HVAP for the big cats. This adaptability gave American units an edge. Even with limited HVAP supplies, they learned to integrate the new ammunition into flexible combined arms tactics. A Sherman platoon working with infantry, artillery, and air reconnaissance could achieve results far greater than its specifications suggested. It was this combination, technology plus tactical learning, that gradually turned the tide against Germany's armored forces in the West. The HVAP across Europe. As production increased slightly toward winter, more HVAP rounds reached the front lines. By November 1944, factories were producing around 5,000 rounds per month, and by early 1945, nearly 7,000. Even then, total output by war's end was only about 33,000 rounds, barely enough to keep up with demand across hundreds of tanks in Europe. By contrast, a single armored division might expend thousands of regular shells in just 1 week of combat. HVAP remained a rare commodity, distributed by need, not by want. Reports from other theaters mirrored those from Arracourt. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, tankers again faced heavy German armor in bitter winter conditions. There, the VAP's high velocity gave the 76mm Shermans a fighting chance against not just Panthers, but even the occasional Tiger I or King Tiger. In one after-action account from the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, a gunner described engaging a Tiger at roughly 800 yards with an HVAP round. The first shot struck below the turret ring, no effect. The second penetrated clean through the side. The tank erupted immediately. We didn't wait to see more. Even so, these encounters remained exceptions. The Tiger's massive frontal armor, up to 150 millimeters thick, was beyond the limits of the 76mm gun, even with HVAP. Against such opponents, U.S. forces still relied on tank destroyers like the M36 Jackson, armed with the 90mm gun. By late 1944, that weapon too received its own tungsten-cored HVAP ammunition, the M304, which could penetrate roughly 221 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, finally giving American crews a true answer to Germany's heaviest tanks. The combination of 76mm and 90mm HVAP-equipped vehicles brought a long-awaited parity to the Western Front. Industry versus battlefield. Yet while battlefield reports spoke of success, the struggle behind the scenes continued. Tungsten's scarcity forced constant trade-offs. Every batch of HVAP rounds meant fewer cutting tools for aircraft factories or artillery production lines. To stretch supplies, engineers experimented with substitutes, trying steel-cored designs, depleted alloys, or tungsten steel composites. None matched the performance of pure tungsten carbide. At one point, ordnance planners even considered reclaiming tungsten from spent rounds, collecting battlefield remnants, melting down the fragments, and reprocessing them. But the logistics were hopelessly impractical. The war was moving too fast. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, the question became not how to make more HVAP, but what lessons to carry forward. The value of tungsten-cored ammunition had been proven beyond doubt, but so too had its limitations. In a future war, no army could depend on such a scarce material for widespread use. While the Allies grappled with scarcity, the Germans faced collapse. Their tungsten shortage was even more dire. Sweden and Portugal, under pressure from both sides, had sharply curtailed exports. What little tungsten the Reich managed to secure went to critical industrial tooling, not ammunition. By late 1944, German APCR armor-piercing composite rigid rounds, their equivalent to HVAP, were nearly non-existent. Panther and Tiger crews often went into battle with standard steel-cored shells only. In that sense, both sides were fighting under material constraints, but the Americans had the advantage of industry, logistics, and adaptation. The Panther, formidable as it was, became increasingly vulnerable as its enemies learned its weaknesses. By early 1945, Allied air power, artillery, and improved ammunition combined to make the once-feared tank a liability more than an asset. At Arracourt, the Panther had already met its match in the form of American tactics and a few ounces of tungsten. Now, across Germany, the pattern repeated. By the end of the war in Europe, the lessons of the HVAP round were clear. Speed and precision mattered more than brute caliber alone. The idea of using sub-caliber, high-density penetrators, essentially smaller, faster projectiles made of ultra-hard material, would shape post-war weapons design for decades. In the laboratories at Aberdeen Proving Ground, engineers studied captured German designs and refined their own. The HVAP was a precursor to the armor-piercing discarding sabot, APDS, and later the armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot, APFSDS, rounds that would define tank warfare in the Cold War. Though the M93 HVAP had been born out of desperation, it opened the door to a new kind of ballistic science, one where velocity, density, and materials engineering were as decisive as the tank itself. The tungsten shortages, the frantic production schedules, and the combat improvisations of 1944 had all pointed to a single realization. Firepower was not just about size. It was about smart design and industrial might working together. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the battlefields of Europe were littered with the wrecks of steel, Panthers, Shermans, Tigers, and T-34s, mute evidence of the most intense armored clashes the world had ever seen. Among the thousands of spent casings and shell fragments lay a few with gleaming cores of tungsten carbide, the remains of a weapon that had quietly reshaped tank warfare, the M93 HVAP round. Though never produced in vast numbers, the VAP's impact far exceeded its quantity. For the U.S. Army, it had provided more than just an edge, it had offered a psychological turning point. Crews who once saw the Panther as invincible learned that, with the right ammunition and tactics, it could be destroyed. That realization changed how American tankers fought, how they trained, and how the Army thought about technology in war. But beyond the battlefield, the VAP story was really about innovation under pressure, a story that would shape military science for generations. The M93 had begun as a stopgap, a hurried solution to a tactical crisis. Yet the idea behind it, using a subcaliber high-density penetrator, was revolutionary. Instead of simply building bigger guns or thicker armor, the HVAP demonstrated that precision engineering and material science could achieve similar, even superior, results. After the war, U.S. engineers analyzed its performance meticulously. Tests confirmed what crews in France had already learned. The VAP's speed and density gave it a vastly better penetration-to-mass ratio than conventional shells. In some trials, a 76mm HVAP penetrated as much armor as an 88mm steel round at half the weight. The only real drawback was range. Because the VAP's aluminum jacket gave it poor aerodynamics, it lost velocity quickly and performed best at under 1,000 meters. That limitation led scientists at Aberdeen Proving Ground and British researchers at Ordnance Board Shoeburyness to explore ways to shed the outer jacket mid-flight, the birth of the discarding sabot concept. By 1947, the first APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot, rounds were entering service. These used a smaller, dense penetrator encased in a lightweight sabot that peeled away after leaving the barrel, allowing the core to continue at extreme velocity. In essence, the HVAP had paved the way for a new generation of ammunition that would dominate armored warfare for the next century. For the industrial planners of the U.S. War Department, the HVAP also carried a sobering lesson. No weapon, however effective, could be fielded beyond the limits of material supply. Tungsten carbide remained essential for peacetime industry, for cutting tools, jet engines, and advanced machining. The war had shown that global access to strategic materials could decide the fate of armies. In the years that followed, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union all began securing tungsten reserves, investing in mines from China to Portugal and South America. During the early Cold War, tungsten became a key element of national security, as vital as oil or uranium. The stockpiling programs of the late 1940s and 1950s, overseen by the Defense Minerals Administration, had their roots in the shortages that once limited HVAP production. The legacy of HVAP lived on in the next generation of tank armament. The U.S. Army's M26 Pershing, which entered service in the closing months of the war, was armed with a 90mm gun capable of firing both steel and tungsten-cored ammunition. Post-war versions refined the gun further, using improved HVAP and APDS designs that could penetrate armor exceeding 200mm thick. Across the Atlantic, British engineers working on the 17-pounder and later the 20-pounder also drew heavily from the HVAP concept. Their APDS ammunition would prove decisive in the Korean War and remain standard into the 1960s. The Soviet Union, too, recognized the concept's value. Their post-war BR-350P and later BR-412D rounds followed similar principles: small, dense cores fired at immense velocities, a direct conceptual descendant of the M93 and its German counterpart, the PZGR-40. By the 1970s, the lineage was unmistakable. The modern APF-SDS, armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot round, now the standard tank shell in virtually every army, was, in essence, a perfected HVAP. The idea of focusing kinetic energy through a dense penetrator had evolved from emergency wartime improvisation into a permanent cornerstone of military design. And tungsten remained at its heart. Whether fired from an American M1 Abrams, a British Challenger 2, or a German Leopard 2, the long, dart-like penetrators of modern tank rounds owe their ancestry to those first small HVAP shells carried into the mist near Arracourt. The VAP story also reflected a broader truth about the American war effort: the ability to identify a problem, mobilize science, and deliver a practical solution under pressure. It was not the only technological innovation of the war. Radar, proximity fuses, and jet propulsion all transformed warfare, but HVAP illustrated how even small advances, properly applied, could have outsized effects. In the summer of 1944, the U.S. faced a tank crisis. Its main gun could not defeat the enemy's best armor. Instead of waiting years for a new tank, engineers, metallurgists, and factory workers collaborated to solve the problem with the tools they had. The result was imperfect, limited by resources, but good enough to shift the battlefield balance. That blend of urgency, pragmatism, and technical brilliance would become a hallmark of American military development in the decades that followed. If the HVAP had a proving ground, it was Arracourt. The battle's outcome: 285 German armored vehicles destroyed against just 35 American losses, stunned observers. Analysts later concluded that weather, tactics, and coordination were decisive, but they also acknowledged that the VAP's contribution, though numerically small, was symbolically huge. At Arracourt, the myth of German invincibility cracked. American tankers, once cautious and defensive, began to fight aggressively, confident in both their tactics and their ammunition. General Patton, reviewing the reports, praised his armored divisions for their initiative and precision. But behind those qualities was something deeper, a quiet shift in morale. The men now knew they could stand toe-to-toe with the vaunted Panthers and WIN. The years immediately after the war, the HVAP faded from public memory. It was a specialist's weapon, one known mostly to tank crews, ordnance officers, and engineers. Yet its influence rippled across the entire post-war design philosophy. The notion that velocity and penetration could trump size and mass led directly to the arms race of post-war tank design. Tanks grew heavier, yes, but their guns grew faster, their ammunition more refined. The HVAP had shifted the paradigm from brute force to scientific precision. Even the name HVAP survived, appearing in manuals and research papers into the 1950s, long after the M93 itself was obsolete. The term became shorthand for any high-velocity, dense-core penetrator, a tribute to the weapon that had first carried the acronym into battle. For all its technical achievements, the HVAP story was ultimately about people. The crews who loaded those precious few rounds, the engineers who stayed up nights perfecting alloy ratios, the factory workers who handled each tungsten core as if it were gold. Lieutenant Merwin Men, the officer who fired one of the first HVAP rounds at Arracourt, later recalled that day with characteristic understatement. "We didn't know what those shells were made of, only that they worked. That was good enough for us." His words summed up the entire ethos of wartime innovation. Results first, explanations later. The M93 HVAP never became a household name like the Sherman or the Tiger, but in the quiet calculus of war, it mattered immensely. It represented the point where science, scarcity, and necessity converged, where the course of a battle could hinge on a few ounces of an exotic metal mined half a world away. From the fog of Arracourt to the foundries of America, the HVAP told a story of adaptation, of how an army confronted with a superior enemy weapon refused to accept defeat and instead found a way to fight smarter. In doing so, it not only helped win battles but also changed how armies thought about the future. The age of the tungsten bullet had begun, and with it, the modern era of armored warfare.